On the morning of February 24, 2022, as Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border and missiles tore open the skies above Kyiv, a different kind of war was beginning on the water. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, one of the most powerful naval forces in the region, moved into position with the confidence of an empire that had never been seriously challenged at sea in modern times. 74 warships, a battle-hardened flagship, and centuries of Russian naval tradition backed by nuclear deterrence. Vladimir Putin had every reason to believe the Black Sea would become a Russian lake within days. What happened instead rewrote the textbooks of modern naval warfare. To understand what Ukraine did to that fleet, you have to understand what the fleet represented. The Russian Black Sea Fleet was not just a collection of warships. It was the material expression of Russian imperial mythology. A force stationed in Sevastopol, the ancient port city that Russia seized from Ukraine in 2014, and which Moscow had romanticized for over 2 centuries as the cradle of Russian naval glory. Sevastopol was the city that had withstood siege during the Crimean War, the city that Soviet propaganda immortalized in the Second World War. For Putin, keeping that fleet dominant and untouchable in those waters was as much about identity as it was about strategy. The fleet's flagship, the guided missile cruiser Moskva, was named after Russia's own capital. A 12,490-ton behemoth armed with 16 SSN-12 Sandbox anti-ship cruise missiles, commissioned in 1982, and the largest surface combatant Russia deployed in the theater. To sink it would be an act not just of war, but of historic humiliation. On the very first day of the invasion, the Moskva steamed up alongside Snake Island, a tiny Ukrainian outpost in the Black Sea, and broadcast a demand for surrender to the island's 13-man garrison. The response from the defenders became one of the most famous phrases of the entire war. The soldiers told the Russian warship, in the most explicit terms imaginable, exactly where it could go. The Russians overwhelmed the island within hours. But those soldiers had inadvertently announced something to the world, that Ukraine did not intend to submit. Not on land, not at sea. Ukraine's military situation at sea was, by any conventional measure, hopeless. The country possessed virtually no functioning surface navy. Its small fleet had largely been seized or neutralized in 2014. What it did have was ingenuity, desperation, and a small number of domestically developed anti-ship missiles called the Neptune, a weapon Ukraine had rushed into service in March 2021, just 1 year before the invasion began. The Neptune was based on Soviet-era engineering developed by the Luch Design Bureau in Kyiv and refined into a cruise missile with a range of up to 280 kilometers. It was, by any comparison, a David sling. The question was whether David could actually see the giant well enough to hit it. On the afternoon of April 13, 2022, a Ukrainian Neptune operator stationed east of Odessa was staring at radar returns that made no sense. The Moskva was positioned roughly 120 kilometers from shore, well beyond the 18-kilometer effective detection range of the system's standard radar. Under normal atmospheric conditions, the ship would have been completely invisible, but that day, an unusual meteorological phenomenon was bending the laws of physics. Northerly cyclonic winds had swept warm, dry continental air over a cooler, moisture-saturated marine boundary layer on the Black Sea. The resulting temperature inversion trapped low-level clouds between the radar installation and the warship, causing the radar's electromagnetic pulses to curve along the Earth's surface far beyond their designed horizon. Nature itself was conspiring against the Russian Navy. The Ukrainian operator detected a blip of enormous size. There was only one thing in that sector of the Black Sea that could produce a return of those dimensions. After several minutes of consultations, the operator gave the order. 2 R-360 Neptune missiles launched with a short interval between them. Their flight time to target was approximately 6 minutes. Aboard the Moskva, the crew had no idea what was coming. According to intelligence reconstructed afterward, the Russian sailors believed themselves to be in complete safety. Their own radar systems, relying on conventional coverage, showed nothing. The ship's air defenses were not raised to full alert. Decades of Soviet-era complacency, compounded by the particular arrogance that comes from commanding a ship named after your nation's capital, had rendered the crew psychologically blind to threat. At approximately 20:42 local time on April 13, 2022, the Moskva was struck on the port side. Fire reached the ammunition magazine. The vessel burned through the night and sank the following morning while being towed toward Sevastopol, becoming the largest warship destroyed in combat since the Second World War and the first Russian flagship sunk in battle since 1905. Russia's initial response was a masterpiece of denial. State media claimed a fire had accidentally broken out on board. The crew had been evacuated. Nothing unusual had occurred. But the images told a different story. Photographs circulating online showed a gaping hole in the ship's port side. The United States Department of Defense confirmed what Ukraine had announced. 2 Neptune missiles had killed the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Moscow's attempt to manage the narrative collapsed in real time. The families of missing crew members began publicly demanding answers. Ukrainian stamps featuring the Moskva were printed and sold out within days, 700,000 in a single week. Ukraine commemorated the wreck site as an underwater cultural heritage location. Russia, for its part, would not formally acknowledge in court that the Moskva had been sunk by a missile strike until January 2026, nearly 4 years after the ship went down. The psychological impact of the sinking radiated far beyond the tactical outcome. Within the Russian fleet, the invincibility that had defined their operations evaporated overnight. Other Black Sea Fleet vessels moved further south after the loss of the Moskva. Russian naval commanders began recalibrating their threat assessments. But Ukraine was only beginning. Kiev understood something that Russia had not yet fully absorbed, that in a confined maritime theater like the Black Sea, innovation and asymmetric capability could neutralize raw tonnage. The question was how to sustain and accelerate the campaign without a single conventional warship to speak of. The answer arrived in the form of unmanned surface vehicles, naval drones, effectively waterborne kamikazes packed with explosives and guided remotely over the horizon. Ukraine had been developing these systems in secret, and by mid-2023, they began deploying them with increasing audacity. The Magura V5, a sleek, low-profile craft costing approximately $250,000 per unit, could be guided via satellite link to targets dozens of kilometers away. In October 2022, a coordinated drone boat attack struck vessels inside the fortified port of Sevastopol itself, an attack so bold and so unexpected that it prompted the temporary withdrawal of the Russian fleet from the harbor. The psychological pressure was immense. Sevastopol, the symbol of Russian naval prestige in Crimea, was no longer safe. Russia attempted to reassert control. Anti-drone nets were stretched across harbor entrances. Patrol helicopters were dispatched along anticipated drone approach routes, with up to 30 rotary wing aircraft airborne simultaneously at peak periods. Electronic warfare systems were deployed to jam and spoof guidance signals. Surveillance UAVs maintained constant overhead watch, but Ukraine adapted faster than Russia could contain it. New drone designs were introduced. Guidance systems were updated to circumvent jamming. Operators refined their tactics, launching coordinated swarm attacks designed to overwhelm point defenses by sheer numerical pressure. On January 31st into February 1st, 2024, Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, known as the GUR, conducted what would become one of the most documented naval drone operations in history. A special unit called Group 13 deployed a swarm of Magura V5 vehicles against the Russian missile corvette Ivanovets in the Donoslav estuary. Footage released by Ukraine showed the vessel attempting evasive maneuvers before being struck multiple times and sinking. The corvette, valued at approximately $60 to $70 million, was gone. The pace of losses accelerated dramatically. On February 14, 2024, 5 Magura Vi-5 drones struck the large amphibious landing ship Cesar Kunikov 4 kilometers off the coast of Crimea. The vessel, which had reportedly been transporting weapons and ammunition, sank after a catastrophic explosion on its port side. The thermal imaging footage of the attack was released publicly, a ghostly clinical record of a warship dying in the dark. On March 5, 2024, the patrol ship Sergei Kotov was attacked and sunk. By the end of March 2024, Ukraine's Navy spokesman stated publicly that Ukraine had disabled or destroyed 1/3 of the entire Russian Black Sea fleet. The British Ministry of Defense went further, declaring in that same period that the Russian Black Sea fleet had become, in its assessment, functionally inactive. What was happening in strategic terms was extraordinary. Russia, facing mounting losses in Crimea's ports, made the fateful decision to relocate the bulk of its surviving fleet from Sevastopol eastward across the Black Sea to Novorossiysk, a Russian port on the mainland coast, further from Ukrainian strike corridors. From a Russian public relations standpoint, this was catastrophic. Sevastopol, the mythologized home of Russian naval power for 2 centuries, had become untenable. Satellite imagery confirmed the exodus. Analysts watching the feeds could track ship by ship the slow hemorrhage of Russian naval presence from the Crimean Peninsula. The pride of Putin's Black Sea strategy was fleeing. But Novorossiysk was not sanctuary, and it was merely a delay. Ukraine extended its drone operations and pursued the relocated fleet into Russian territorial waters. In June 2024, Ukraine made a further declaration that shook Western intelligence communities. It claimed to have destroyed all of the Black Sea Fleet's missile carrier capability based in Crimea. The Kaliber cruise missile, Moscow's signature weapon for striking Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, had been launched from Black Sea Fleet vessels 160 to 180 times per year in 2022. By the final months of 2024, that figure had collapsed to fewer than 8 launches per month. Russia was quietly transferring Kaliber stockpiles from other fleets just to sustain even a minimal rate of fire. The fleet that had terrorized Ukrainian cities with missile volleys was running dry. The technological evolution of Ukraine's naval campaign did not pause. By January 2025, Ukrainian engineers had armed their unmanned surface vehicles with adapted Soviet-era R-73 air-to-air missiles, and a drone shot down a Russian military helicopter that was operating as part of the fleet's anti-drone patrol network. In May 2025, the Magura V-7, the next generation of Ukraine's naval drone, downed 2 Russian Su-30 fighter jets over the Black Sea, the first time in history that surface-launched drones had destroyed fixed-wing aircraft in open water combat. The drone that had begun as a cheap explosive delivery system had evolved into a multi-domain weapons platform capable of challenging air superiority. The rules of the game were not being bent. They were being broken and rewritten in real time. By early 2026, the assessment coming out of Western defense ministries was stark. Russia no longer possessed a functioning navy in the Black Sea in any meaningful operational sense. Ukraine, a country with no surface fleet, limited defense budgets, and a military structure improvised under fire, had effectively driven the Russian Navy from open waters entirely. The fleet that remained huddled in ports that were themselves no longer fully secure. The grand instrument of Russian power projection across the Black Sea had been reduced to a liability, a target, an embarrassment. Even Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers, the opaque network of aging vessels used to circumvent Western sanctions, was being targeted. In November 2025, Ukrainian sea drones struck 2 sanctioned tankers associated with Russian energy logistics and separately damaged a critical Caspian pipeline consortium terminal. Ukraine was not just fighting a navy. It was dismantling an entire system of Russian maritime power. The lessons being absorbed by Western military establishments are profound and deeply unsettling to conventional naval doctrine. Rear Admiral Michael Mattis, commander of Task Force 66 for U.S. Naval Forces Europe-Africa, described the Black Sea campaign as a foundational case study for the future of naval warfare, one that has direct implications for the Baltic Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and most pointedly for the contested waters around Taiwan, the Philippines, and the South China Sea. A drone costing $250,000 had repeatedly destroyed vessels worth tens or hundreds of millions. A nation without a navy had neutered a navy. The calculus of maritime power, built on decades of assumption about hull count, tonnage, and firepower, had been exposed as dangerously incomplete. What Putin tried to conceal in the chaos of early justifications and state media narratives was that his fleet had walked into a trap of its own making. The fleet's vulnerabilities, aging electronics, conscript crews, inadequate damage control, radar systems blind beyond their short horizons, anti-drone defenses decades behind the threat curve, were not secrets. They were institutional failures that years of corruption and procurement fraud had embedded into the very steel of his ships. Ukraine did not merely discover these weaknesses, it systematically, methodically, and brilliantly exploited them, with homemade missiles guided by anomalous weather, with explosive drones built on crowd-funded platforms, with intelligence, innovation, and a refusal to accept the verdict that the sea was lost. The flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet now rests on the bottom of the Black Sea, approximately 120 kilometers south of Odessa, at a depth of roughly 45 meters. Its name, Moskva, is inscribed in the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Register as underwater site number 2064. The ships that followed it to the bottom carry no such commemoration. They were simply erased. And the fleet that remains, scattered, diminished, retreating, stands as one of the most consequential military defeats of the 21st century, inflicted not by a superpower, but by a nation fighting for its life with weapons it largely built itself. That is the story that history will record, and it is far from over.